Okay, so for this lecture, I get another short one, but I just want to kind of put you in the right mindset because what you're about to learn is really cool, and once you realize it's really cool, it's easier to learn. So I want to kind of promote a little of that cool, and I also want to connect it up with some of the other things we've already been talking about in this course, so that you get a real sense of kind of how things fit. All right, so remember Rene Descartes, and I talked about how he, made this very powerful argument for what he called dualism. Dualism being the sense that we as human beings, well, first of all, he thought animals were totally biological machines, that's all there was to it. They were just biological machines. Humans, he thought, were also biological machines, that most of what you see when you see a human, Descartes would argue, was a biological machine. But in fact, a soul could somehow interface with that machine and control it. So he thought sometimes the machine worked on its own in a sort of reflexive way, and he talked a lot about reflexes. Sometimes it was controlled by a soul, a more spiritual entity that actually controlled the machine. So that dualism means two. And so he would say there are these two bases of human behavior. Sometimes it's just reflecting the machine. Sometimes it's reflecting the soul controlling the machine. No matter what, he opened the door to this notion that we were perhaps biological machines, that this body and everything within us is a complicated biological machine. Now, I told you also that Luigi Galvani followed up on some of that work and ultimately showed that with a little bit of electricity applied to a frog's leg, it would do the dance thing. So this was important because, by the way, Rene Descartes, at his point, he was fascinated by all the liquids in our body, all the blood and phlegm and all that kind of stuff. And he thought we might be hydraulic machines. I don't know if you remember, but hydraulics was a new thing in Rene Descartes' day. And so a lot of people were really interested in it. But what Luigi Galvani showed is it doesn't seem to be the fluids that make the body move, that animate the body. It seems to be electricity. Now, electricity was the thing of Luigi Galvani's day, which was, we're into the 1800s now, and electricity was a big deal, and a lot of people were fascinated by it. And then when Luigi suggests, look, it makes a body move, makes an inert body move, that started to make people think this biological machine is electrical. And as you'll find out, it is. It's electrochemical. Yeah, let's get into that in a moment. So I want to add this to it just to kind of get your thinking this way. At about this same time, Mary Shelley, who understood a lot of the scientific and medical advances that were going on, writes the novel Frankenstein. What's the novel Frankenstein about? It's about creating a creature out of spare body parts. So Dr. Frankenstein finds an arm over here and a head over there and whatever, and he sews these all together, and he somehow, makes the biological machine whole again and all connected as it's supposed to be. We're not sure how he does that, but he does that. But then what happens? How does he bring the monster to life? Well, he sets up this complicated device so that lightning will hit the top of his castle where he does his science, and that lightning electricity will charge to Frankenstein's body, and it will be that bolt of electricity that turns this inanimate body into a living body. And of course, that's what happens. Frankenstein comes to life when he's struck with electricity. What Mary Shelley's book shows is the fascination a lot of people had during this time about two things, really, about the human body and really thinking of it as a machine. And this is why, I don't like those animal studies. I don't like those vivisection studies that we've talked about. But the reason people were fascinated with them is they were trying to understand the parts of this machine. And of course, they started with things like hearts and lungs, organs that were visible and that were relatively simple. But they were also always fascinated with the brain. And so that was one of the things, is trying to understand this machine. And you're going to get a better understanding of your machine during this chapter. And the other thing was this notion of electricity. and how electricity played a role. Now, of course, our notion of chemistry was coming along a long way at this time as well. And as you know, chemicals have electrical charges. So a lot of the stuff you're going to hear about in this chapter is about this electrochemical machine we are at. So as you're going through that, keep in mind this sort of image of Frankenstein, and the idea that you are a machine, at least in part. Maybe you agree that there's a soul. Maybe you agree with Rene that there's a soul that can drive this machine every now and then. Psychology won't totally contradict that, although we won't call it a soul. We'll call it consciousness. And you'll learn a little bit about how it can control the body as we go through. But for now, just kind of have this wonder of, wow, you are a Frankenstein of a sort. You are, what was envisioned here, a body that's somehow been put together in working order and then animated with electrical chemical energy. And that's what you're learning about in this chapter, how that all works. Pretty cool. I think it's pretty cool. Let me just also highlight that the approach we'll be taking here is something called methodological reductionism. I just like to introduce you to some of these terms that you're going to run into throughout your career here. And reductionism is the scientific attempt to provide explanation of something in terms of ever smaller entities. And so what we mean there, the classic example was in the understanding of matter. People tried to understand things around us. And what are they? Even like a glass. What is this? How do we think of what this thing is? Well, eventually, to understand this glass, they went all the way down to the atomic structure. All the way down. By down, I mean smaller and smaller and smaller units until we get to the actual structure of the molecules which jam together, make up this glass. You're going to see that same sort of principle. So that was highly successful in chemistry. And so therefore it became a model that a lot of scientists follow. When Descartes threw out his notion of the animal as a machine, in fact, Vaucanson here created this little image. In fact, he created an automatic duck. He decided to create a duck that could eat food and poop it out later. I don't think it digested it very much. Might have crunched it a bit. I don't know. But his notion was to show that the idea was viable by actually building it. And so then once again, he had to start thinking about little subsystems and building the little subsystems and how they all work, etc. And so we're going to do the same thing with the brain in this chapter. We're going to start with the brain proper, which by the way is about 2 pounds of matter sitting in your skull. And we're going to think about it at a number of levels. And we're actually going to start by jumping all the way down to a level kind of like the molecule. And then we will come back up and talk about how we get to a more system level of what the brain is doing. Now, it won't be a chemical molecule. It'll be one of these little guys, a neuron. Okay, and this will be the basic building block that we will focus on when we think about how the brain works, because the basic thing the neuron does is take in information from other neurons and other parts of the brain, sort of make a decision about the information it's taken in, and then potentially send signals itself down this. So it's going to take in information from these guys called the dendrites. It'll come in. Some of this information will be telling this cell to go ahead and send information itself. Others will be saying, don't do it. So it'll sum all these do-its and don't do-its. It'll decide if the do-its are high enough, if there's enough stuff coming into this cell to tell it to fire, it will send its own message down its axon and out its so-called axon buttons across a synapse where it's releasing neurotransmitter. You're going to get this whole story, but this is the basic core of how the brain works, these units. So let's talk about these units a little bit first. And I'm going to let the textbook do a lot of the talking. I've actually brought in a video because, as I say, biology is not my strong suit. And so, why not recruit some people who are better at it to explain it than I. And so you'll go through that. But then I'll be on the other end of this to tell you some of the implications of this neurochemical machine. We'll connect it back up to drugs and that discussion of psychiatry and psychology. So I will see you there. Alrighty, thanks. Bye bye.